floating currency system is illusory. It's based on the concept of value. And even though there is no benchmark, the default world's reserve currency is the dollar. The dollar, the game of the dollar is, as many commentators have said, is it's a constant game to try and maintain the nature of its value. If this value gets defaulted or it loses its value, there will be hyperinflation. All of our paper currency will lose value practically overnight, which means it makes sense to start investing more and more of your paper currency into gold and silver. And an example would be edinar.com. If you go there, you can buy through your investing cash gold, which you have the option to have physically delivered, or it can be maintained in a safe place. This can be reintroduced by Islamic banks, not only as deposits, but as a form of currency amongst themselves. As a form of currency amongst themselves. There's nothing to stop Islamic banks from introducing gold and silver as the mode of a B2B currency, a business-to-business currency that exists amongst Islamic banks. Sandra, I think we had some technical issues. Hopefully it wasn't the banks cutting us off. Okay, the point was here that gold and silver can be reintroduced as a B2B currency, as a currency that Islamic banks can operate amongst themselves. What this would do is it would provide a way of increased stability and distinguishing the Islamic banking industry further from the conventional banking industry. Another thing Islamic banks could do was to introduce the idea of time banking and let system. Time banking is a very different model of credit, the idea of credit being services that can be exchanged without the use of physical currencies. This could be administrated or looked to by the Islamic banks. Unless we think this isn't happening, this already is happening. Ithaca hours, which is an idea of serving people. So if I go and mow your lawn, for example, I run up a credit in terms of services. I can then get that reimbursed by other people. And this was administered by the Bank of Ithaca in New York. Islamic banks can do something similar. What this does is it connects unmet needs with unmet resources, and more importantly, builds societal relationships through mutual reciprocity. This is also similar to the let system, and this too can be done under the cash waqf structure because we've cut off the commercial profit maximization dynamic. So to recap, Islamic banking is having a problem because its structural dynamic, its structural organization is it doesn't allow or is not in sync with its social, moral, ethical perspective. The way that we can bring this change is by bringing about an organization that is more in sync, and traditionally that organization has been the waqf. 2/3 of the Ottoman economy was administered by waqf. At the time of its dissolution, 3/4 of its land belonged to awqaf. The Ottomans had practically relegated social welfare to the awqaf. Awqaf were most importantly locally based and managed. There is a need to revive these institutions. If all of the Islamic banks were to embed cash waqf, and this would become a systemic process, society would completely change. There are certain societies which have been capitalized, where this may not be practical, but there are other places such as Pakistan and parts of the other parts of the Middle East, the more impoverished parts of the Middle East, where such a structure could work. How could it work? We would need a case of will and courage. The direction can be changed by changing these operating structures, but inevitably, when you try and bring these changes, Islamic finance, perhaps very much like its capitalistic counterpart, which makes a lot of money for a lot of people, may find a lot of resistance. When I mentioned some of these concepts to certain people in the Islamic finance industry, the result was this is completely impractical because the board of directors at the commercial bank would never accept it. Inevitably, who are these board of directors? Who are the executive management that make up much of the management of Islamic banks? 20 years spent in Citibank, a lifetime of being indoctrinated. I'm not saying they're not sincere, but if your remit or your understanding or your paradigm operative has been conditioned by the risk-based maxim of credit-based interest lending, then you're not willing to accept anything else. And so anytime we discuss anything different, if it has to be evaluated by people whose training is the exact opposite, then it's a bit of an oxymoron, it's a bit of a vicious circle. Change requires courage. Whenever the economic change or a change that threatens the dominant economic paradigm is put forward, it requires courage. And we have the best of examples as Muslims in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet was concerned about the environment, and we as Muslims should be concerned about the environment. Our concern of the environment should lead us to spur the nature of commercial banking, and we should join hands with a sustainable financial community. The Prophet established a green belt of 12 miles around Medina. He prohibited the cutting of trees. He prohibited the polluting of water. He encouraged the revival of barren lands through assigning property rights, which, interesting enough, is very similar to what the Kyoto Accords proposes to do. Most importantly, when he proposed a different social dynamic, a dynamic under the unity of worshipping one God, the real opposition he faced was not because he was threatening the religious paradigms of the people. The real opposition he faced was because he threatened the economic structure. The multiple gods that existed in the Kaaba was symbolic of the trade allegiances or the trade relationships that the different tribes had. If the other idols were to be destroyed, this would have destroyed the trade relationships. And so the opposition that the Prophet faced was an economic opposition. And he was given encouragements. He was told, we'll offer you the choicest women. We'll make you king. You can have your system 1 year, our system the other year. He didn't budge. He said, you place the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left hand. I will never leave this message. This is the courage that we need in the face of change, because those who seek to embark on a genuine change for Islamic finance will face opposition. But the way of change in Islam, someone was asked about change. E.F. Schumacher was asked, how can we really change? E.F. Schumacher said, plant a tree. A tree is very symbolic. A tree implies continuity with the past. A tree has roots, and a tree implies aspiration as it rises up into the sky. The analogy of the tree was used by the Prophet. He said, if the end of time comes and you have the chance to plant a tree, then plant it. Our maxim for change in Islamic finance is not premeditated or conditioned on what we consider success or non-success in this worldly life. It is based on living your life by your principles, being sincere to your principles, so when we die and we face our Lord, we fulfilled our obligations of being Khalifa, representatives, stewards on the face of this earth. Wa akhir dawa and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. We will now come to some of the practical situations. Things we can do now. I think all of us here should now take, if we agree with some of the points raised in this presentation, we should try and create lobby groups. We should send letters to Islamic banks. But interestingly enough, the nature of the industry has created an industry whereby the 5 top Islamic finance scholars are now literally sitting on the majority of the Islamic boards. The thought leadership of Islamic finance has the potential to change this industry. If ever there was a lobby group of power, these 5 top Islamic finance scholars have that power. And if you were to look at some of the information on the internet, such as the presentation by Murat Unal, in which he details the number of Sharia boards certain scholars sit on, you will be aware of who these scholars are. These scholars need to be engaged. These scholars need to provide answers to these questions, and these scholars need to be engaged to some of the issues raised in these presentations. We encourage yourselves and ourselves to create lobby groups and to speak to them. And the idea of lobby has a negative connotation. We're not implying that these scholars are not sincere, but the idea of interaction. Similarly, IOFI. IOFI as a tremendous organization has produced a lot of work, but in terms of thought direction, it is often reactionary. IOFI reacts to industry dynamics, post-event. What we need from IOFI is firstly a watchdog capacity and thought leadership. How do we embed these cash waqf into the Islamic banks? Traditionally, there was always another moral dimension to Islamic economy, the dimension of hisba, the idea of self-regulated markets. We need the dimension of hisba. We need the dimension of self-regulation. There needs to be a moral regulation of what's happening in Islamic banking. The closest thing that can do this to my mind is IOFI. The scholars need to think beyond just ratification of products or legal discussion to moral discussion, to discussion of direction. And in that regards, IOFI then can propose certain initiatives. IOFI can say, we want you, Islamic banks, to embed cash waqf within you. We want you to direct this to local communities. Now, if the banks turn around and say, this is not necessary by the Sharia, it's true. But are we limiting our Sharia discussion to simply halal and haram from a rights perspective, or are we looking at the long term? If your neighbor is dying of hunger and the long term effects would be he would die, you could say, in ordinary circumstances, are you obligated to serve him food? But is that how our Sharia discourse has become? If IOFI could bring about initiative to say Islamic banks should establish these institutions and then act on it by downgrading the banks or the institutions who do not comply in their membership, this could become an incentive or incentivization from a moral perspective for the banks to move forward. Islamic finance scholars need to develop a more refined fiqh that takes into account, or jurisprudence, that takes into account means and ends, especially concerning the environment. We need to actively engage with the local sustainable community finance, and they need to answer the Quranic question for all of us, فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ? Where then are you headed? Our education in Islamic finance universities, and there aren't many, but those that do exist, such as programs in the UK, Reading, Aston, Durham, those in Malaysia, Islamic Finance University Malaysia, International Islamic University Malaysia, the International Islamic University in Islamabad, INCF, these organizations need to engage now with the sustainable development financial community. This is already happening within academia within the UK. The University of Southampton has commissioned an entire department called the Centre for Banking, Finance and Sustainable Development. Some of the resources our Islamic finance education programs can have resource to are foundations such as the New Economics Foundation, a think tank, FISTA, another think tank, or the Schumacher College, another college in the UK, and Islamic. We need to move beyond labels. We need to move beyond this Islamic Big Mac label and look at principles and engage with the other uncommon principles who actually may be giving our discourse. Other things that we can do, and this is much of what I discussed under the pretext of community financing or community sustainable initiatives, don't actually need a banking model. They don't even need an operative structure. But the reason why I proposed a cash waqf was because this systematizes the process. It gives it weight and it gives it the potential of being a change. Otherwise, we can bring many of these initiatives ourselves. There's nothing to stop us as communities trying to bring about community currencies. There's nothing to stop us as communities to try and remove credit from our lives. And there's nothing to stop us as communities to try and reintroduce open markets. There's nothing to stop us as communities to trying to deal with people and communities more and depersonalize institutions less. Some recommended reading out there that I think would be helpful to all. An analysis of, there's been a slight change. I mean, I originally proposed another book, but that's not here, Analysis of Usury. So The Mystery of Banking is a good analysis of the debt-based financial system, and especially the fractional reserve system. The Grip of Death is once again a good analysis of that by Michael Rowbottom. Creature from Jekyll Island, ignore the title, is a look of how policy formation often accompanies the interests of big banks and corporations. And once again, Goodbye America. The title is not meant to stint American anyway. It's basically illustrating the fact of how policy post-Second World War created an environment at the level of the global level that directly favors certain interests. Very important. I think everyone should read this book, The Growth Illusion, because when you see the word growth illusion, you have to think riba. This illusion has been created by riba, and Richard Douthwaite has written an amazing book on that. And his second book, The Short Circuit, is now an illustrative of much of the techniques that we were discussing, community level financing, and the practical ways that things can be done. I think this is the end of the presentation, if I'm correct. There's one more book, and I encourage us all to read this. Charles Eisenstein, he's written another book called The Ascent of Humanity, and he analyzes the spiritual dimensions of economics. And the idea being, if you read this would, though I may not necessarily agree with the entirety of what he's saying, I do agree with the bulk of it, and I think much of us from an Islamic perspective would agree with the bulk of it, and it produces a very different community and a very different wider societal dynamics. Question answers and comments.
Thank you, Yusuf, for your most informative presentation, and